So the next section is about discourse. So I guess my first question is that I found your comments about the depoliticized nature of language to be fascinating. Last week somebody raised the point that many youth don't possess the ideas or vocabulary to express their own exploitation. Given that it's difficult to fight something that you don't understand, how do you propose progressives go about building the capacity within the youth population to challenge the dominant power structures?
I think that one of the things that progressives are going to have to do is get smart around this issue and make education central and pedagogy central to any notion of politics that they want to take seriously. I mean, you don't just offer a language of critique and hope people are going to plug in, right? I mean, you have to build the institutions and the formative cultures that expand the possibilities for young people to embrace a language that isn't just utterly privatized, deregulated, and commodified. I mean, we need to take seriously the language of democracy, the language of the social, the language of community. And we need to do it by building institutions and alternative discourses that see that as an educational project linked to the radical imagination and the production of new kinds of agents, new kinds of individual and social agents. This struggle over the social is a discursive issue, to say the least. It's a battle over how we define agency. But it's also an institutional issue because ideas die in the absence of public spheres that enable them. So, I mean, you're talking about both developing ideas and developing new languages and alternative narratives, but you're also talking about developing infrastructures that can sustain them. That's the challenge.
Okay, so let's turn to Canada for a second. We've seen youth engage in various protest movements over the past couple of years. Be it Occupy, the Maple Spring Idle No More. What do you make of these movements, particularly the Canadian ones, like the Quebec student protests and Idle No More?
Oh, the Quebec student protest movement was, to me, a remarkable movement. I mean, it was remarkable in a number of ways because not only did the students organize in such a way prior to actually the movement erupting to create the basis for a movement that could sustain itself, talking to professors, talking to other students, thinking clearly and strategically about how their visions could be implemented and how the critiques that they were making could be taken seriously. They also, once that organizational involvement and strategy emerged, they also began to connect what appeared to be issues that were relevant only to students to a broader set of considerations that involved the entire society, moving from the question of not increasing tuition to the question of social benefits, not to the question of expanding all kinds of social services that were being cut back, to, in a sense, focusing on larger societal issues that connected a whole range of differences around the question of what it meant to live in a radical democracy. I thought that was brilliant. But that was actually done in a way that was far exceeded, I thought, the strategic strategies of the Occupy movement. I thought they were they were far more advanced in some ways. And I think the I Don't Know More movement is enormously crucial because it makes visible the most invisible of social injustices. It makes visible a question of disposability that is right at the heart of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. The indigenous populations, who are the most disposable of the disposable, and how those populations are not only making clear the injustices that they've had to suffer from for years under these governments that have simply ignored them, but are now making demands in such a way as to suggest that our needs are also about your needs, that we're all fighting for something equally, aren't we? We're fighting for what it means to live in a democratically just society. So it's not just about self-interest. It's not just about reclaiming treaty rights or reclaiming land or doing something to eliminate the poverty that our communities have to, and lack of resources that our communities suffer under. But what it means to raise the bar about a democracy in general, so that the No Idle movement is not just about indigenous rights, it's about democratic rights.
Okay, so over the past months, we've seen a number of new movements pop up in Turkey, Brazil, Bulgaria. It seems that we're reaching a critical spot in history. What's your prospects for actual reform occurring?
I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, I think that many people view these uprisings in sometimes romantic ways. They romanticize them, you know. I mean, in all of these countries, the dark shadow is the military. Right? I mean, these are countries where the military basically has the force. These are not countries that are basically controlled simply by political parties. And I think there are two issues. I think that this is going to take, these are terrific beginnings, because it enables people to recognize the power of social movements in both attracting the kind of publicity they need and for engaging the kind of issues that need to be made visible. But they also suggest the need to understand the long march through institutions. The fact that these processes take time. You know, they're going to take time. But I think the seeds have been sown. I think we have seen ruptures, you know, cracks in the wall, unlike we've ever seen before. And the water is leaking through. The dam hasn't broken yet, but it will. It's just a matter of time.
So how do we re-inject optimism into society? You know, will it be possible to rebuild the institutions of the social welfare state?
I think signs of optimism are everywhere. They're in Chile, they're in Turkey, there are people sacrificing their lives, they're in Syria. You know, I mean, I think that we have never seen so many insurgencies opening up in countries that were seen as forever living under the reign of these internal dictatorships. That alone provides something. But I think that what we see that I particularly like are two things, right? I think we're watching and seeing an outburst of civic courage that testifies to a kind of motivation that suggests, outside of people being motivated by the greed of the Wall Street ethic, there's also the possibility of being motivated by public values in which you can believe that a democracy is possible that serves everybody. That's a shift. That's a shift from what we see in the media, it's a shift from what we see in Hollywood, it's a shift from what we see coming out of the culture of cruelty that neoliberalism produces, and it offers and inspires people. And I think that inspiration globally is enormously important. Secondly, we see the development of a new language. This language is not simply about singular injustices. It's about a whole complex range of injustices that are tied together under authoritarian systems in which there's a merging of what we might call market tyranny and militarization. And that's new.
Okay. So I guess my final question would be, how do progressives go about actualizing the democratic notion of the social? You know, has anybody articulated a vision for such a project that you like?
You know, you see bits and pieces of it in various movements. You know, I mean, actually, I like what I mean. There's a range of people: Stoughton Lynn, Noam Chomsky, Stanley Aronowitz, Arundhati Roy. I mean, you know, there's a range of people who are now developing these. Tony Judd, before he died, you know, in some ways, there's a re-emergence of this, what I call the discourse of the social, you know, the discourse of the civic, you know, the discourse of social responsibility. We see it coming back because the injustices are so overwhelming that you can't address those injustices within the framework of, call it what you may, neoliberal capital, casino capitalism, monopoly capitalism. When you look at that framework and you look at the massive inequalities it's produced and the incredible damage it's doing to whole generations of people and to the environment, you know, you need a different discourse. And so the conditions are now emerging for that discourse to take place. And the consequences of those authoritarian anti-democratic processes are so overwhelming that there's a new kind of language is emerging. One that not only is the language of critique, the language of transformation. People are not just talking about critique, they're talking about transforming the society. Nobody wants to reform it anymore in the liberal way. Nobody wants to say, you know, we need better elections. That's just nonsense. And, you know, when you have this massive degree of inequality, in power and wealth, elections are useless. I mean, they're just silly.
Mhm.
They make no difference whatsoever. So we're really talking about structural change. We're not just talking about a form of identity politics that says we need more rights for gays or we need more rights for indigenous people. Yes, we do, but that's not enough. And I think that broader that resurgence of that civic language and the resurgence of an affirmation of the social, along with the talk about structural change and the need to limit, inequitous structures of power, really represents a rupture that, in my estimation, speaks to this notion of the radical imagination.
Okay, do you have any closing words for youth who might be watching this interview?
I think that the future's in their hands, and I think they need to fight for it. And I think they need to educate themselves. They need to work collaboratively. They need to reach out and touch as many people as they can. They need to exercise a great deal of courage, and I think they need, in a sense, to be able to hear their own voices. I think to be voiceless is to be powerless, and they've been voiceless for too long. And I think it's time to really, in a sense, rise up and do what they have to do within the law, of course. I believe in nonviolent protest. I don't believe in violent protest. But I think that they can stretch the boundaries of direct action. I think they can invent a politics where going to the polls is not the most important thing they do. But most of all, they've got to do two things. They've got to make education central to any viable notion of radical politics. And secondly, they have to do it in organizations in which they can broaden the possibility for exercising political and social power.